HOA tried to steal his 1,500 acres with a forged abandonment claim. But when this Texas rancher dug into his father's old files, he found a piece of paper that turned the thieves into his tenants overnight. Calvin Rourke never expected the knock on his door that Tuesday morning to change the course of his life. The sun had barely lifted over Pine Bluff County, and he was still nursing his first cup of black coffee when a man in a pressed polo shirt and shiny leather shoes handed him an envelope. No greeting, no explanation. Just a curt, "You've been served." Calvin stared at the papers inside, his brows tightening. It was an official notice from the Pine Bluff Estates Homeowners Association declaring that his 1,500 acres had been lawfully transferred to a development company for unpaid association dues. Dues he never agreed to. Dues he didn't owe. He read it twice. The words were bold, printed in that cold legal font that always made bad news feel worse. His name was there. His father's name was there. And then the kicker. The HOA claimed the land was abandoned. Calvin felt his jaw clench. Abandoned? I mowed the southern pasture myself last week, he muttered under his breath. By the time his neighbor, Donovan Pike, stopped by to borrow a wrench later that morning, Calvin was pacing on his porch. "They say I abandoned it," Calvin said, handing Donovan the notice. Donovan scanned the papers, his eyes narrowing. "They've lost their damn minds. You're not even in the HOA, are you?" "Never signed a thing. My father never signed a thing. We've got the records to prove it," Calvin said. But Donovan shook his head slowly. "Priscilla Kavanaugh's behind this. She's been talking for months about getting that land developed." Calvin knew the name well. Priscilla had a reputation in Pine Bluff Estates. Polished, always in control, and ruthless in HOA meetings. She didn't make moves without a plan, and if she was involved, this was no accident. The 1,500 acres weren't just dirt and grass. They were his father's legacy, and his grandfather's before that. Every fence post, every grazing pasture, every live oak casting shade in the summer had a story. His father, Russell Rourke, had built his life on that land, hauling water in droughts, patching barns after storms, and raising cattle with the kind of patience you only learn when your livelihood depends on the weather. Calvin could still hear his father's voice on the day he handed him the deed. "This land is your family's backbone, son. Treat it like it's alive, and it'll take care of you." Now, some HOA paperwork claimed to erase all of that. By noon, Calvin was on the phone with the county clerk's office. He spent nearly an hour on hold, tapping his boots against the wooden floor while the hold music droned in the background. Finally, a clerk named Angela Hargrove picked up. Calvin explained the situation, his tone clipped but controlled. "Mr. Rourke," she said after checking the records, "there's a recorded sale here. It was filed just last week. The seller listed is Pine Bluff Estates HOA." Calvin gripped the phone. "And where in your records does it say they own my land to sell it?" She hesitated. It doesn't. That was the moment he knew something wasn't just wrong. It was deliberate. Someone had gone to lengths to make this look legal, and they'd counted on him being too slow, too busy, or too tired to fight back. That night, Calvin barely touched his dinner. He sat at his kitchen table, spreading the notice and his own deed side by side. He knew every inch of that property, from the creek bed in the north field to the old oak stump by the south fence line. The idea that strangers could take it on paper without ever setting foot on it was more than theft. It was an insult. When the phone rang again, it was his younger cousin Troy Bingham, who lived 2 counties over. "Heard about what happened," Troy said. "You're gonna fight it, right?" "You bet I am," Calvin replied. "But I need to know how far back this goes, and who else is in on it." There was silence on the line before Troy spoke again. "If it's Priscilla, she's got people on that board who'll back her no matter what. You'll need more than proof. You'll need leverage." Calvin didn't sleep much that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he pictured strangers tearing up the pastures, pouring concrete where his father once ran cattle. But the more he thought about it, the clearer it became. They'd made one critical mistake. They thought he'd just roll over and take it. but Calvin had no intention of letting this go quietly. Calvin woke up before dawn the next day, not out of habit, but because his mind refused to rest. The early hours were always when the land felt most alive, even if it was just in his memory. He brewed another pot of strong coffee and stepped onto the back porch. The mist clung low over the pastures, just as it had when he was a boy, and for a moment it was like his father was still there, leaning against the railing with that slow, steady presence that could calm a storm. The Rourke land had never been just property. It was woven into the family's identity. His grandfather, Jasper Rourke, had bought the first 200 acres back in the late 1920s, at a time when black landowners in East Texas were rare, and holding on to land was even rarer. Jasper had endured neighbors who wanted him gone, banks that made loans impossible, and drought years that nearly broke him. But he never sold an inch. By the time Calvin's father, Russell, took over, the ranch had grown to 1,500 acres through grit and careful deals. Calvin remembered riding in the passenger seat of an old Ford pickup while Russell drove out to check the cattle. He'd point at different patches of land and tell stories about the storm in '72 that dropped a barn roof into the creek, about the drought of '83 when they had to haul water from the river every day for 6 weeks. "This land," Russell would say, "isn't worth a thing unless you put yourself into it. Sweat, time, and heart. That's the only way it means something." It was that same sweat and time that Calvin had poured into the place for decades. He knew every fence post that leaned from years of weather. He could tell you where the best grazing grass grew after a wet spring. He even knew the spot where the soil turned red and rocky, not good for crops, but perfect for wildflowers in May. As he sipped his coffee, his eyes drifted to the north pasture. That was where the boundary line met the edges of Pine Bluff Estates, the very neighborhood whose HOA now claimed to own what was his. Back when the subdivision first went in, Calvin had thought little of it. Some developer bought a chunk of land adjacent to his, built houses with neat driveways, and moved in folks who liked to host barbecues on Saturdays. His father had warned him back then. "Once you've got people with committees and boards, they'll try to control more than what they bought." Calvin hadn't thought much of it. Until now. The fight for land had always been a quiet one in Pine Bluff County. Families lost it to unpaid taxes, or bad deals, or by being tricked into signing away mineral rights. What happened to Calvin was a sharper, modern version of the same story. The HOA hadn't come with threats or violence. They'd come with paperwork. That afternoon, Calvin drove into town to visit his aunt, Gloria Rourke Fields, the family historian. Her small brick house smelled faintly of lavender and old books, and every wall had framed photographs of relatives stretching back nearly a century. She greeted him with a hug and an immediate question. "Calvin, what's wrong? You look like someone took the wind out of you." "They're saying I don't own the ranch anymore," he told her, explaining the notice and the supposed sale. Her eyes narrowed behind her glasses. "That's Russell's land, your grandfather's land. They can't just take it. They already filed the paperwork with the county," Calvin said. "But I'm not letting it slide." Gloria disappeared into the back room and came out with a worn, leather-bound folder. "These are the old deeds, not the copies, the originals. Jasper kept them in a safe for decades. You'll want to go through every page." Calvin took the folder carefully, the leather warm from her hands. Inside were yellowed papers with ornate lettering, each page telling a story of how another piece of land was added to the Rourke holdings. It was proof of just how hard his family had worked to keep what was theirs. Before he left, Gloria put a hand on his arm. "This isn't just about land, Calvin. This is about respect. If they take this from you, they'll think they can do it to anyone." On the drive back, those words stayed with him. The land was personal. Losing it would mean losing the very ground his family had fought for, and handing a victory to people who thought power gave them the right to take from others. But Calvin also knew that history had a way of leaving hidden tools in the present, and he had a feeling he hadn't found all of them yet. 2 days later, Calvin parked his truck across from the Pine Bluff Estates Community Center. The small brick building doubled as the HOA's meeting hall, and on Tuesday evenings the board met behind closed doors. Tonight was one of those nights. He'd called ahead, asked if he could attend, and got a clipped response from the HOA secretary. "You're not a member, Mr. Rourke. This isn't open to the public." That was fine by him. He wasn't here to sit quietly and watch them talk. He wanted to see who came and went, to read faces and body language. From the cab of his truck, he spotted Priscilla Cavanaugh stepping out of a black Lexus SUV. Tall, in a tailored cream blazer and pearl earrings, she had that practiced air of someone who believed every room belonged to her the moment she entered it. She spoke briefly with a man Calvin recognized as Wesley Drummond, a local realtor who'd brokered deals for the subdivision years ago. Wesley looked uneasy, glancing around before following her inside. Calvin's mind kept turning over the same question. How did they even pull this off? The county clerk had confirmed the sale was filed. That meant someone had created documents convincing enough for the system to accept. He suspected Wesley had a hand in it, but he needed proof. The next morning, Calvin called Angela at the county clerk's office again. "Angela, is there a way to see who signed the sale documents?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "But you'll have to come down here and request a certified copy. You want me to have it ready?" "Please," he replied. By noon, Calvin was standing at the clerk's counter with a folder in his hand. The sale agreement was 3 pages long. There it was in black ink. The HOA listed as the seller, Pine Bluff Estates Development Group as the buyer. And the signature authorizing the sale? Priscilla Cavanaugh as HOA president. Calvin felt his jaw tighten. He flipped to the second page and saw the abandonment claim, a statement that the land had been unused, unmaintained, and unpaid for more than 3 years. It was pure fabrication, and anyone who'd driven past his property in the last month could have testified otherwise. That evening, Calvin called Donovan. "I've got the paperwork. Priscilla signed off on the sale herself." "Then it's time you talk to her directly," Donovan said. "Oh, I will," Calvin replied. "But not until I've got more than just a copy of this. I want her backed into a corner with nowhere to run." Over the next few days, Calvin noticed subtle changes around the northern boundary. Survey flags appeared in the grass. A contractor's truck idled by the fence line one afternoon. He walked up and spoke to the driver, a young man with a clipboard. "You with the developer?" Calvin asked. Yeah," the man replied. "We're just marking for some preliminary work. They told us this is Phase 2 expansion." Calvin crossed his arms. "This isn't their land. You tell your boss that." The man gave a half shrug and drove off, but Calvin knew the message probably wouldn't go far. Word spread quickly in Pine Bluff County when something big happened, and this was no exception. By the end of the week, 3 different people had stopped Calvin at the feed store to ask if it was true he'd lost his property. Each time, he set them straight. "I didn't lose a thing," he told them. "It was stolen, and I'm going to take it back." One of those conversations was with Frances Doyle, a retired schoolteacher who'd lived in Pine Bluff Estates since it was built. She leaned in close and lowered her voice. "Calvin, I don't know if this helps, but I've seen Priscilla having late-night meetings at her place. Wesley's been there more than once, and so has a man from the developer's office. Folks say they've been planning to reallocate land for months." That word, reallocate, made Calvin's stomach turn. It was a polished way of saying, take what isn't yours. Back at home, Calvin pulled out the old folder Gloria had given him. If the HOA could fabricate claims, he could counter them with facts. Real documented history. That night, he sat at the kitchen table under the yellow light, scanning through deeds, tax receipts, and land maps. And that was when he saw something he hadn't noticed before. A small, handwritten note in his father's script attached to a map of the subdivision. Acquired mineral and ground rights for Blocks 3-7, 1990. Blocks 3-7. That was a huge chunk of Pine Bluff Estates. Dozens of houses sitting on land the Rourkes actually owned beneath the surface. Calvin leaned back in his chair. The air in the room seemed to shift. The HOA thought they'd taken everything from him, but they had no idea they'd been living on his land for decades. But before he made a move, Calvin knew he needed to be certain, and that meant finding the original documents proving those rights were still in effect. The following morning, Calvin drove out to the County Records Archive in Lufkin, an hour's ride from Pine Bluff County. It was an old limestone building with wide stone steps and heavy oak doors, the kind of place where history didn't just sit. It collected dust and waited for someone stubborn enough to dig it up. Inside, a clerk named Royce Flannery greeted him with a tired smile. "What brings you here today, Mr. Rourke?" "I'm looking for a land rights agreement from 1993, Calvin said, sliding the folded note across the counter. "Blocks 3 through 7, Pine Bluff Estates subdivision. Should be under my father's name, Russell Rourke." Royce adjusted his reading glasses and frowned at the paper. "That's going to be in the basement vault. It's not digitized. Give me a few minutes." Calvin followed him down a narrow stairwell lined with filing cabinets that looked like they hadn't been moved in decades. Royce flipped through thick ledgers, his fingers brushing across yellowed pages until finally he pulled out a large leather-bound record book. Inside was the original deed transfer, notarized, signed, and stamped by the county. It clearly stated that Russell Rourke owned the mineral and ground rights to those blocks, with no expiration. Calvin's pulse quickened. This wasn't just leverage. This was a hammer. With these rights, he technically owned the land under those homes, meaning every homeowner, including Priscilla, was essentially his tenant. Back at the ranch, Calvin spread the documents across his kitchen table. He called Troy. "You sitting down?" Calvin asked. "Yeah. Why?" "I've got the original deed. Blocks 3 to 7. Still valid." There was a pause on the line, then Troy let out a low whistle. "You realize what that means, right? They tried to steal your land, but they've been living on yours this whole time." That night, Calvin's phone rang again. This time, an unfamiliar number. He answered cautiously. "Mr. Rourke, this is Elena Vargas from the Pine Bluff County Chronicle. I'm working on a story about a dispute between you and the HOA. Would you be willing to comment? Depends on what you've heard." Calvin said, "I've heard your land was sold to a developer for unpaid dues, but I've also heard you never joined the HOA." "That's correct," Calvin replied. "And I've got proof they had no right to touch my land. But that's all I'm saying for now." Elena pressed for more, but Calvin kept his answers short. He didn't want to tip his hand too early. Still, the fact that the local paper was sniffing around meant the story was already spreading beyond whispers. The next few days brought more signs that something was brewing. One morning, he found a fresh "No Trespassing" sign nailed to the fence line bordering the subdivision. On his side of the fence. The wood was still raw, the letters in black spray paint instead of the clean stencil the county used for official signs. Later that afternoon, he saw a group of HOA board members standing together in a driveway, talking in low voices. When Calvin drove by, they went silent and stared. One man, Graham Fielding, gave him a thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. That evening, Donovan dropped by. "They're nervous," Donovan said. "I've been hearing chatter from a buddy who lives in the estates. Priscilla's telling people you're making trouble just to block development. She's painting you as a roadblock to progress." "Progress for who?" Calvin muttered. "Certainly not the people losing their homes to rising taxes and HOA fees." Calvin knew this was how they operated. Twist the story, control the narrative, and make the person they wronged look like the villain. But this time, the facts were on his side, and if he played it right, the truth would come out in a way they couldn't bury. One afternoon, while checking the fence along the north pasture, Calvin spotted a man in a suit standing near the corner lot. He recognized him from Francis Doyle's description, one of the developer's representatives. Calvin walked up slowly. "Can I help you?" he asked. The man gave a polite but guarded smile. "Just here to inspect some property." "This is my property," Calvin said flatly. The man glanced down at his clipboard. "According to our records, your records are wrong," Calvin cut in. "And you'll want to fix that before you find yourself on the wrong side of a courtroom." The man didn't reply. He just closed his folder and walked back toward his car. Calvin watched him drive away, the weight of the deed in his mind like a loaded rifle. He'd been patient so far, gathering facts, keeping calm. But he could feel the tide turning. The HOA and their allies thought they had the upper hand. They were about to find out they'd been standing on shaky ground the whole time. But before Calvin made his first public move, he wanted one more conversation, with Priscilla herself. The next Friday evening, Calvin parked his truck in front of the Kavanaugh residence. The sun was low, casting long shadows over the manicured lawns of Pine Bluff Estates. Priscilla's two-story brick home stood at the corner of Rosemont Drive, every shrub trimmed to perfect symmetry, every light bulb in the porch sconces glowing warm. Calvin had called earlier, leaving a message with her assistant that he wanted to talk face to face. She hadn't responded, but he knew showing up in person left her little choice. As he stepped out of his truck, he caught sight of movement behind the sheer curtains in the front window. A moment later, the door opened. Priscilla stood there, one hand on the frame, the other clutching a crystal glass of white wine. "Mr. Rourke," she said, her tone polite but clipped. "I wasn't expecting visitors." "I figured you wouldn't mind, seeing as you've been handling my business without my consent," Calvin replied. Her eyes flickered, just for a second, before she motioned him toward the porch. "I'll give you 5 minutes." They stood with the low hum of sprinklers in the distance. "You sold my land," Calvin began. "You knew I wasn't part of your HOA. You filed that sale as if I'd abandoned it." Priscilla sipped her wine slowly. "The land wasn't being used to its fullest potential. The development will bring growth to the community. My family's been using that land for almost 100 years, Calvin said. "And I've got proof you've been sitting on property that belongs to me. Blocks 3 through 7. I own the ground you live on, Priscilla." The glass paused halfway to her lips. "That's impossible." Calvin pulled a folded copy of the original 1993 deed from his jacket pocket and held it out. "Take a look." She scanned it quickly, her composure slipping just enough for him to notice the faint tightening of her shoulders. "That's a technicality," she said finally, her voice lower now. "It's the law," Calvin countered. "And if you don't reverse what you've done, I'll start exercising my landlord rights. Evictions, rent demands, whatever it takes." Priscilla's gaze hardened. "You're bluffing." Calvin stepped back toward his truck. "You'll find out soon enough." That night, Calvin returned home and spread his father's documents across the kitchen table again. He wanted to be certain there were no gaps in his claim. Gloria's old folder was a treasure trove of records. Tax payments going back decades, mineral rights agreements, boundary surveys. But one envelope caught his attention. It was marked in Russell's handwriting, HOA Property Deal, Keep. Inside was a letter from a man named Charles Behrens, the developer who'd originally built Pine Bluff Estates. Dated April 1990, it confirmed that as part of a land swap to allow the subdivision's roads to be laid out, Russell Rourke had been granted the underlying rights to specific blocks in perpetuity. Charles had even included a hand-drawn map highlighting the exact plots. Calvin leaned back, exhaling slowly. This wasn't just leverage. It was airtight. The HOA's own existence was partly built on a deal that made his father their landlord. The next day, he called Troy. "I'm ready to move," Calvin said. "You sure? Once you do this, there's no going back," Troy replied. "I've been sure since the day they tried to steal my land. Now I've got the paperwork to crush their whole argument." Before making his move, Calvin called Eleanor from the Chronicle. "I've got something you'll want to see," he told her. "But I'm only showing you if you run the story straight. No spin." "I'm listening," she said. They met at a diner off Highway 287. Calvin slid the envelope across the table. Elena read through the documents, her eyes widening. "This changes everything," she murmured. "If this is valid, the HOA's actions could blow up in their faces." "It's valid," Calvin said. "Every page. I want people to know what really happened before they try to paint me as some bitter rancher holding up progress." By the time Calvin left the diner, he knew the clock was ticking. Once Elena's story hit the front page, the HOA would be in damage control mode. But he wasn't worried. He'd waited patiently, gathering facts, letting them think they had him cornered. He climbed back into his truck and glanced toward the subdivision in the distance. They'd stolen in silence, hidden behind legal jargon and closed-door meetings. Now the tables were about to turn. But before the story went public, Calvin planned to take one decisive legal step that would hit them harder than anything they'd ever expected. By Monday morning, Calvin had already signed the papers with his attorney, Reed Jameson, a tall man with silver hair and the kind of calm voice that made judges lean forward in their chairs. Reed specialized in property disputes, and when Calvin laid out the facts, he didn't waste time sugarcoating it. "They went after the wrong man," Reed said, flipping through the documents. "We'll file a petition to void the sale immediately, but I'm also recommending we initiate landlord action on blocks 3 through 7. That will make them realize just how deep this goes." Calvin nodded. "I'm ready." The petition was filed that same afternoon, but Calvin wasn't done. He wanted to look Priscilla in the eye one more time, this time in a setting where she couldn't hide behind her porch and a glass of wine. The HOA had scheduled their monthly meeting for Tuesday evening, and though they'd tried to keep him out before, Calvin arrived early and stood by the entrance. A few board members shot him uneasy glances as they walked in. Priscilla arrived last, stepping out of her Lexus with that same confident posture. But when she spotted Calvin, her pace slowed. "This is a members-only meeting," she said coolly. "I'm here as your landlord," Calvin replied, holding up a certified copy of the 1993 deed. The words landed like a hammer. A few members paused mid-step, exchanging confused looks. Priscilla tried to brush past him, but Calvin followed her inside. "Since we're being formal, let's put this on the record," he said. "You tried to sell my land under false claims, but you've been living on mine for 30 years. That means you, and everyone in blocks 3 through 7, have been my tenants without realizing it." The room went still. Wesley Drummond's jaw worked like he was searching for the right words. "That's absurd," he said finally. "The subdivision was built fair and square. Read the original agreement," Calvin said, sliding the document across the table. "Your fair and square sits on Rourke land, my land." Priscilla's voice was sharp. "You think you can scare us with old paperwork? This is a community, Mr. Rourke. People have built their lives here. And my family built ours on the ranch you just tried to steal," Calvin shot back. "The difference is, I have the law on my side." The tension in the room was heavy. A couple of board members began leafing through the deed, whispering to each other. One of them, a man named Clinton Avery, looked up and said quietly, "If this holds up in court, we're in trouble." Priscilla's glare could have cut glass. "We'll see what a judge says." "Oh, you will," Calvin replied, stepping toward the door. "And in the meantime, you might want to tell your neighbors to expect some letters in the mail." The following morning, Reed filed the landlord notices. They weren't eviction letters, not yet, but formal demands for rent backdated 3 months. Each envelope carried Calvin's name at the top, along with the legal description of the land beneath each home. Within 2 days, the phone at Calvin's ranch started ringing non-stop. Some calls were angry, homeowners demanding to know if it was a joke. Others were nervous, asking if they could meet with him to work something out. Calvin kept his responses calm. "Take it up with your HOA president." One evening, Frances Doyle called again. "They're panicking, Calvin," she said. "People are talking about removing Priscilla from the board. They feel blindsided." "They should," Calvin replied. "She put them in this position." Meanwhile, Elena's article hit the front page of the Chronicle. The headline read, "Local rancher fights. HOA over land. Claims he's legal landlord to dozens of homes." The story laid out every detail, from the questionable sale of his 1,500 acres to the decades-old deed giving him rights to the subdivision blocks. Photos of Calvin standing at the ranch fence accompanied the piece, along with a shot of Priscilla looking distinctly uncomfortable outside the HOA office. By the week's end, local TV stations were knocking on Calvin's door. He gave a short statement to one reporter, his words measured. "This isn't about revenge. It's about holding people accountable when they abuse power." But in private, Calvin knew it was also about showing them they couldn't bully him into silence. They'd crossed a line, and he was prepared to walk this fight all the way to its end. But just as the pressure started to mount on the HOA, Calvin learned the developer wasn't backing down, and their next move would take things to a whole new level. 2 days after the article went public, Reed called Calvin with an update. His tone was calm, but there was a weight behind it. "They've hired a big Dallas law firm," Reed said. The developer's name is on the motion, not the HOA. That means they're stepping in to defend the sale, and they're arguing you have no standing to challenge it. Calvin leaned against his kitchen counter, phone pressed to his ear. No standing? They tried to steal my land. They're claiming you abandoned it. Reed explained, and that your mineral and ground rights to the subdivision blocks are irrelevant to this case. They want the court to treat those as two separate issues. Calvin paced the floor. So they're trying to cut the legs out from under me. That's exactly what they're trying to do, Reed said. But here's the thing. If we can tie those two issues together, we can make the case that they acted in bad faith on both fronts. That's where the leverage becomes powerful. Later that day, Calvin met Reed at his downtown office. Spread across the conference table were stacks of documents, property maps, tax receipts, old correspondence between the Rorks and county officials. Reed pointed to a highlighted section in the 1993 agreement. This clause is gold, he said. It specifies that your rights to blocks 3 through 7 are perpetual and transferable, meaning they can't be separated from the land. That's the connection we need. If the judge sees they ignored this clause when they filed the sale, it shows intent to bypass you entirely. Calvin sat back, letting that sink in. He thought of his father, sitting at his own table with a pen in hand, insisting on every line in that agreement. Russell had always said, if you're going to sign something, make sure it protects you long after you're gone. Now, decades later, that advice might be what saved the ranch. The first hearing was set for the following Wednesday in the Pine Bluff County Courthouse. Calvin arrived early, wearing a clean white shirt, pressed jeans, and his father's old belt buckle, a subtle reminder to himself of why he was there. Priscilla and Wesley sat together at the defense table, their attorneys whispering in low voices. On the developer's side, two suited men with expensive watches scrolled on their tablets, barely acknowledging Calvin's presence. When the judge entered, Reed stood and presented the petition to void the sale. He walked the court through the history, the Rourke family's ownership, the HOA's false abandonment claim, and finally, the 1993 agreement tying Calvin to the subdivision land. The opposing attorney tried to object, claiming the subdivision rights were a distraction from the real matter at hand. Reed didn't flinch. Your Honor, the so-called real matter is that my client's property was sold without his consent. These rights prove a pattern of the defendants disregarding his legal ownership in multiple ways. It's not a distraction. It's the heart of the case. The judge allowed the evidence in. Priscilla kept her gaze fixed forward, but Calvin could see her grip tightening on the edge of the table. After the hearing, as everyone filed out, Wesley brushed past Calvin. You're making a lot of enemies, Rourke, he said under his breath. Calvin didn't slow his step. You made that choice for me when you signed off on a lie. Outside the courthouse, Elena was waiting with a cameraman. How do you feel about today's hearing? She asked. Like we're just getting started, Calvin said. They thought I'd be too small to fight back. They were wrong. That evening, Reed called again. We've got a window, he said. The judge hasn't made a ruling yet, but she's giving us the chance to submit more supporting evidence before next week. That means anything you've got, photographs, receipts, witness statements, we pile it on. Calvin thought of Donovan, Francis, Gloria, and even the young contractor he'd spoken to by the fence. Every one of them had seen something that contradicted the HOA's claims. If they were willing to speak on record, it could be the final push the case needed. The next day, Calvin began knocking on doors, not to threaten, but to gather stories. He listened as neighbors recalled seeing him work the land, tend cattle, repair fences. Francis even produced old photos from a 4th of July picnic held on the north pasture, taken just 2 years ago. By Friday, Reed's office was stacked with proof. Calvin knew they were in for a fight, but for the first time since the man in the polo shirt had handed him that envelope, he felt momentum building in his favor. But then came a letter from the developer's lawyers, a settlement offer that made Calvin stop in his tracks and wonder if this was their way of admitting they'd gone too far. The letter arrived in a heavy cream envelope, the kind meant to look important. Calvin slit it open with a pocket knife and pulled out 3 typed pages. The developer's lawyers were offering him a lump sum for the 1,500 acres, a figure that might have tempted someone who only saw the land as dirt and grass. But Calvin saw it for what it was, a buyout meant to end the fight without them admitting fault. He read it twice, then called Reed. "They think I can be bought." Reed chuckled dryly. "If they're making offers this early, it's because they know the ground's slipping under them. But I'll say this, the number's high enough to show they're worried." "I'm not interested," Calvin said flatly. "I'm not just here for a check. I want the land back, and I want them to feel what it's like to be on the losing end." 2 days later, the judge issued her ruling on the preliminary petition. The sale of Calvin's land was voided pending a full trial. The developer's plans were frozen, and the county clerk was ordered to restore the title to Calvin's name until the case concluded. It wasn't the final victory, but it was a blow the HOA and the developer hadn't expected to land so soon. The very next morning, Calvin and Reed moved forward with the landlord action. Official notices were delivered to every home in blocks 3 through 7, each one bearing Calvin's name as the property owner. The language was direct: rental terms to be negotiated within 30 days, or eviction proceedings would begin. Within hours, the subdivision lit up with activity. Cars pulled into driveways, neighbors gathered in tight circles on the sidewalk, and phones buzzed with news alerts. By evening, Calvin's name was trending locally on social media. Some posts painted him as a folk hero, a man standing up to a power-hungry HOA. Others, mostly from within the estates, called him greedy and vindictive. One knock came at dusk. It was Clinton Avery, the board member who'd spoken cautiously during the meeting. He stood on Calvin's porch, hat in hand. "Mr. Rourke, I think it's fair to say things have gotten out of hand," Clinton said. "A lot of folks didn't know about any of this. They trusted Priscilla, and look where that got them," Calvin replied. "This could have been avoided if your board hadn't let her run unchecked." Clinton shifted his weight. "Is there a way to resolve this without kicking people out of their homes?" Calvin studied him for a moment. "I'm not looking to throw anyone out who's willing to make things right, but I'm not letting this HOA pretend they didn't try to take what's mine." Meanwhile, Francis Doyle called again with news. The board had scheduled an emergency meeting to discuss removing Priscilla as president. The pressure from homeowners, now facing rent payments, was more than they could ignore. 3 nights later, that meeting ended in a vote. Priscilla was out. Wesley stepped down shortly after, citing personal reasons. Neither of them spoke publicly, but rumor had it both were consulting lawyers of their own. The shift in leadership changed the tone overnight. The new acting president, Sharon Bell, called Reed directly to propose a settlement. The HOA would issue a formal apology, acknowledge Calvin's rights to blocks 3 through 7, and agree never to contest his ownership of the 1,500 acres again. In return, Calvin would drop the landlord action against residents who signed rental acknowledgements within Tirbiste days. It wasn't everything Calvin wanted. There'd be no admission of wrongdoing for the false abandonment claim. But it was a public surrender on the key points. Reed laid it out plainly. "This deal puts your land back in your name, your rights in writing, and them in your debt. The rest, you can win in reputation." Calvin thought about it overnight. By morning, he agreed, not because he wanted to let the HOA off easy, but because his father had always told him to know when a fight was won. The day the agreement was signed, local news cameras rolled as Calvin stood at the courthouse steps. "This isn't just about me," he told them. "It's about standing up when someone in power thinks they can walk over you. You don't let that slide. Not for a day, not for a dollar." As the cameras clicked, he noticed a few homeowners from the estates watching from the crowd. Some nodded in quiet acknowledgement. Others still looked wary. Calvin knew trust wouldn't come overnight. But that wasn't his goal. His goal had been to protect what was his, and make sure no one tried to take it again. But the story didn't quite end there, because the fallout from Priscilla's removal would ripple through Pine Bluff County in ways Calvin hadn't yet imagined. In the weeks that followed the agreement, Pine Bluff County felt different. You could sense it in the way people talked at the feed store, in how conversations paused when Calvin walked into the hardware shop. Some looked at him with respect, others with suspicion. But no one looked at him like he was just another rancher anymore. Priscilla's absence from the HOA left a vacuum. Without her iron grip on decisions, homeowners began airing complaints that had been ignored for years about rising fees, uneven enforcement of rules, and opaque spending. Sharon Bell tried to steer the board toward transparency, but the fractures ran deep. A handful of residents blamed her for caving to Calvin. One man even stood up at a meeting and shouted, "We got rolled over by one guy with a cowboy hat and a grudge." Calvin heard about the comment the next day from Francis, who delivered it with a smirk. "Sounds like you've got a new nickname in the estates." "I've been called worse," Calvin replied, though privately he didn't like being seen as just a symbol of resistance. His fight had been about more than proving a point. It was about defending his family's legacy. Not everyone in the estates was bitter. Several residents from blocks 3 through 7 visited the ranch to meet Calvin face to face. One older couple, the Beldens, came with a homemade pecan pie. "We just wanted to thank you for not throwing us out," Mrs. Belden said, her voice quiet but steady. "We had no idea any of this was going on." "I know you didn't," Calvin told her. "The people you trusted put you in a bad spot. I'm not here to punish folks for their board's mistakes. I'm here to make sure it never happens again." Still, the settlement didn't erase every scar. The developer quietly pulled out of Pine Bluff Estates, but not before selling their stake in other parcels nearby. Rumor had it they were regrouping, looking for softer targets in other counties. Reed warned Calvin to stay alert. Once a company's played this kind of game, they don't stop. They just shift their sights. Meanwhile, Elena's article had taken on a life of its own. State papers picked it up, framing Calvin's fight as a rare example of an individual taking on both a homeowners association and a developer, and winning. Calvin started getting letters in the mail from people across Texas, sharing their own stories of being bullied by HOAs or losing family land to technicalities. Some asked for advice, others just wanted to say they were rooting for him. One letter stuck with him. It came from a man in Eastland County whose grandparents had lost their farm in the 70s to a similar abandonment claim. He wrote, "We didn't know our rights, and we didn't have the means to fight. You did what we couldn't. Thank you." Calvin kept that letter in the same leather folder as his father's deeds. It was a reminder that this battle wasn't fought in isolation. The HOA, meanwhile, was forced to hold a community-wide meeting to explain the settlement terms. Sharon Bell read the prepared statement acknowledging Calvin's rights to blocks 3 through 7 and confirming that the 1,500 acres were his alone. As she spoke, Calvin stood quietly at the back of the room. Some homeowners glanced at him with guarded expressions, others with relief. After the meeting, a younger homeowner named Eli Cormack approached. "Mr. Rourke, I just wanted to say, I didn't like you much when this started. I thought you were just trying to wreck our neighborhood. But after hearing everything, I get it now." Calvin gave a small nod. "That's all I needed you to do. Get it." Life at the ranch slowly returned to its rhythms. Calvin spent mornings mending fences, afternoons tending the cattle, evenings on the porch with coffee. But every so often, he'd catch sight of the subdivision in the distance, roofs and street lights against the horizon, and remember that part of his land stretched beneath those homes, not in a way that made him smug, but as a quiet reminder of the balance he'd fought to restore. In town, people were still talking about the case months later. For some, it became a cautionary tale about overreaching power. For others, a rallying cry for protecting property rights. Either way, Calvin knew his name would be tied to this fight for a long time. But as the dust settled in Pine Bluff County, Calvin found himself thinking less about the fight behind him and more about the lesson it left, a truth his father had lived by, and one he was determined to pass on. It was a warm spring morning when Calvin finally let himself breathe. The court filings were closed, the ranch was legally secure, and the subdivision had accepted his ownership of the land beneath their homes. For the first time in months, there was no envelope on his porch, no stranger waiting at his gate, no meeting to prepare for. He sat on the back porch with a mug of coffee, watching the pasture grass ripple in the breeze. The cattle were grazing in the distance, and the air smelled faintly of wildflowers. It was the kind of quiet his father had loved, the kind where you could hear your own thoughts clearly. Gloria stopped by mid-morning, bringing a jar of her homemade blackberry jam. She set it on the table and looked out over the land. "You did it," she said simply. Calvin smiled faintly. "We did it. You gave me the folder that turned the whole thing around." Gloria shook her head. "I just handed you the past. You're the one who knew what to do with it." They sat for a while, talking about Jasper and Russell, about the years when money was tight and the land was the only steady thing they had. It struck Calvin then that the fight hadn't been about winning in court. It had been about honoring the sacrifices that came before him. That afternoon, he drove into town to pick up feed. As he loaded the bags into the truck, Eli Cormack spotted him from across the lot. "You mind if I ask you something?" Eli said, walking over. "Go ahead. If you could go back to before all this started, would you still fight it?" Calvin didn't hesitate. "Every time. You can't put a price on what's yours if it's tied to who you are. Once you let someone take it, you'll never get it back." Eli nodded slowly. "Guess I needed to hear that." On his way home, Calvin passed the sign for Pine Bluff Estates. It looked the same as it always had. Neat, painted white, with flowers planted at the base. But to him, it meant something different now. It wasn't just a marker for where the subdivision began. It was proof that even the most polished facades could hide cracks. And when you knew where to look, you could widen those cracks with the truth. The months that followed were quieter. He still had occasional talks with residents about their rental agreements, but most kept to themselves. Some even stopped by to buy beef directly from the ranch. The relationships weren't warm exactly, but they were civil. And that was enough for Calvin. One summer evening, Troy came by with a cooler of beer. They sat on the porch, watching the sun dip low. "You know," Troy said, "you could have taken that developer's offer and been set for life. No one would have blamed you." Calvin took a sip of his beer. "Maybe. But money comes and goes. This land, it's the one thing my family bled for. It's the one thing I can pass down that can't be spent away." Troy grinned. "You're a stubborn man, Calvin. Guess it runs in the family." Calvin replied. The story eventually faded from headlines, replaced by the next controversy in another town. But in Pine Bluff County, people remembered. When someone brought up the case at the diner, it always came with a shake of the head and a quiet remark about that rancher who turned the tables. For Calvin, the takeaway was simple. Power only works if people are too afraid or too tired to fight it. Once you stand up, even against something bigger than yourself, you change the balance. And sometimes that's all it takes to win. Before heading in that night, Calvin walked out to the fence line. The subdivision's lights glowed in the distance, and he could hear faint laughter drifting from an open backyard. He wasn't bitter. In fact, he felt the opposite. A calm satisfaction that came from knowing he'd done right by the people who came before him and the land they'd entrusted to him. He rested his hand on the top rail and said quietly, more to himself than anyone else, "This stays Rourke land. Always." And that was the lesson he hoped others would carry from his story. That some things are worth more than the highest offer, and that standing your ground even when you're alone can be the strongest legacy you leave behind. If you're listening to this and you've got something worth protecting, whether it's your land, your name, or your principles, don't wait for someone else to defend it. Stand up, speak out, and make sure it stays yours. And if you want more stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next fight worth telling.